A woman ran through the swirling snow, her breath tearing out of her in desperate, ragged clouds. The Montana air was so cold it felt like swallowing glass. The hem of her dress, already torn, snagged on a branch, ripping a fresh line up the fabric. Her boots were useless, sinking deep into the powder with every frantic step. She was losing ground. Behind her, the sound. Not just hoofbeats, but a low, hungry rumble that the wind couldn't quite carry away. It was the sound of pursuit, the sound of the end of the line. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Just shadows. Two riders. Dark shapes against the blinding white. They weren't shouting. They didn't need to. The silence was worse. The ground in front of her just vanished. A steep slope, dropping away into a darkness the snow couldn't touch. She had two choices, the men behind her or the abyss in front. It wasn't a choice at all. She plunged forward. Her foot caught a hidden root and the world flipped sideways. She was tumbling, a chaotic mess of limbs and fabric in pure screaming terror. The world spun. Her side exploded in a supernova of pain. Then, blackness. The last thing she felt was the sharp, cruel bite of ice against her cheek. The last thing she heard was the distant rush of water, moving fast and deep beneath the frozen skin of Wolf Creek. Seth Calloway squinted against the driving snow, his jaw set. The storm was coming in fast, a real monster, even by Montana standards. The south pasture fences had to be checked before nightfall. The last thing he needed was his cattle wandering off into a blizzard, becoming frozen statues for the wolves. "Come on, Thunder," he murmured to the big stallion under him. "Let's make this quick." The horse snorted, its breath a cloud of crystals in the frigid air. They followed the winding path of the creek, the world closing in around them, a cocoon of white. Seth's eyes scanned the western horizon. The clouds there were boiling, moving with a speed that felt wrong, unnatural. He'd been in Montana territory for 2 years, long enough to know this was no ordinary storm. This was a killer. Suddenly, Thunder reared up, screaming, almost throwing Seth from the saddle. "Whoa, easy, boy!" Seth gripped the reins, his own heart kicking against his ribs as he steadied the horse. He scanned the landscape, looking for a bear, a wolf, anything to explain the animal's terror. That's when he saw her, a crumpled shape near the creek bank, half buried in new snow, a splash of dark color against the endless white, so still it looked like a discarded doll. Seth was off his horse in an instant, his boots crunching through the crusted snow. It was a woman, young. Her face was as pale as the drifts around her, except for a frozen streak of blood against her temple. He knelt, pulling off a thick glove, and pressed his fingers to her neck. Her skin was like ice, but then, beneath his fingers, a pulse, a faint, thready flutter, a ghost of a heartbeat. "Miss?" he said, his voice rough. "Can you hear me?" No response. The wind howled, driving tiny needles of ice into his exposed skin. He had to get her out of there. He had to get her to shelter. Now. He gathered her into his arms, the weight of her surprisingly slight. And as he lifted her, a realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just any woman. He knew who she was supposed to be. Elizabeth Morgan, the mail-order bride he'd been expecting on the stagecoach from Denver. But this wasn't her. The letters had described a tall woman, blonde, with blue eyes. The woman in his arms was small, her hair a cascade of dark copper against the snow. He didn't know who she was, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the storm, that she was not Elizabeth Morgan. Yet here she was, in the middle of nowhere, running from someone or something in the worst storm of the season. The stagecoach was hours late, probably held up by the snow. So how did she get here? He lifted her onto Thunder's back, then mounted behind her, cradling her unconscious form against his chest for warmth. Questions would have to wait. Survival came first. "Let's go home, boy," he whispered, turning his horse not towards the main ranch house, but toward a small, hidden line cabin a mile up the creek. The distant lights of Wolf Creek Ranch were a beacon, but not for her. Not yet. First, he needed answers, and he had a feeling that the answers would bring a different kind of storm right to his door. 2 weeks earlier, in Denver, Ruby Hayes pressed a damp cloth to her forehead. The world was still spinning. It had been 2 weeks since the fever broke, but her body still felt like a stranger's, weak and unreliable. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. The disease that Edwin Blackwell had given her wasn't a one-time thing. It would come back. Each time it would be worse. It was a death sentence delivered on expensive paper for a fee that had taken the last of her savings. You shouldn't be up yet. Ruby jumped, her heart lurching. Clara Winter stood in the shadows of the back stairs of the Frontier Moon Saloon, her weathered face etched with concern. Can't stay in bed forever, Clara, Ruby said, forcing a smile that felt like cracking plaster. Bills don't pay themselves. Harold will wait, Clara said, stepping closer. Her voice dropped. He feels responsible, letting that snake Blackwell near any of the girls, not after Marianne. Ruby shuddered. Marianne was the first to get sick after a visit from the wealthy businessman. Marianne didn't survive. I'm fine, Ruby lied. It was a lie she'd practiced 1,000 times for 1,000 customers. Just need my strength back. Clara's hand, surprisingly strong, closed around Ruby's wrist. You're not fine, child. I've seen it in your eyes. Death always sends a calling card first. She paused, her gaze softening just a fraction. The West is a funny place. The past only matters if someone digs it up. This territory is full of people who used to be someone else. Everyone gets one chance to start fresh. I don't have the money to go anywhere, Ruby admitted, the truth a bitter taste in her mouth. Don't you? Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. Page 6. Been saving it for you. Ruby took the clipping. In the dim light, she read the small advertisement. Wife wanted. Rancher seeks woman of good character for marriage. Must be capable and adaptable to frontier life. Age 25-35 preferred. Reply to Seth Calloway, Wolf Creek Ranch, Clearwater, Montana territory. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. I'm hardly wife material, Clara. You're 26, smart, and you know how to handle difficult men? Clara shrugged. Sounds like frontier wife material to me. Ruby tucked the clipping into her pocket. I'll think about it. Don't think too long. Clara's expression went dark. Blackwell was asking for you yesterday. Said he had unfinished business. A chill that had nothing to do with her sickness snaked down Ruby's spine. What did Harold tell him? That you'd left Denver, but men like Blackwell don't give up. Be careful, child. I've seen that look in a man's eyes before. He's not just coming back for another night. That night, sleep was a distant country Ruby couldn't reach. Clara's warning, the doctor's verdict, the stack of unpaid bills, they all swirled in her mind. Edwin Blackwell wasn't just a rich client. The whispers in the saloon painted a picture of a man with powerful friends and cruel hobbies. Ruby had seen both, but it was what she'd seen in his ledger that truly terrified her. He'd left it open while he was dressing. Ruby, trained to notice a customer's weaknesses, had glanced at it. Columns of names, numbers, land purchases all over Colorado and Montana. It made no sense, but it felt dangerous. He'd caught her looking. His charming smile had vanished for just a second, replaced by something cold and dead. Curious little bird, aren't you? He'd said, snapping the book shut. That's a dangerous quality in your line of work. Was that why he was looking for her? Did he think she understood what she'd seen? Or was it simpler? Was he just a man who couldn't stand being denied something he thought he owned? A soft knock on her door. Ruby, you awake? It was Harold, the saloon owner. She opened the door. His face, usually ruddy, was pale. What is it? Two men, he said, twisting his hat in his hands. Associates of Mr. Blackwell. They're asking which room is yours. Ruby's blood went cold. What did you tell them? I said I fired you. They didn't believe me. They're watching the place, Ruby, front and back. I have to leave, she said. The decision was instant. Tonight, Harold nodded, pressing a small, clinking pouch into her hand. Your back wages, plus extra. Clara suggested the morning stage to Cheyenne. Thank you, Harold. Just be gone before sunrise, he sighed. I'll have one of the boys start a fight, draw them away from the back door. Ruby moved with a sudden, desperate energy. She packed her few things, a silver hairbrush from her mother, a small knife, 2 dresses, and a warm cloak. She scrubbed her face clean of paint. pulled her fiery copper hair back into a severe bun. In her plainest dress, she looked like a different person, a nobody. As a stage fight erupted in the saloon, she slipped out the back. The air was cold with the promise of winter. She hurried towards the stagecoach office, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The Denver depot was a hive of activity. Ruby kept her head down, joining the line for tickets. "Next," the clerk called. "One ticket to Cheyenne," she said, her voice a whisper. As she reached for her coin pouch, she froze. Through the depot window, she saw him, one of Blackwell's men. He was scanning the crowd, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Ruby ducked out of line, hiding behind a stack of luggage. Cheyenne was too obvious. It was the first place they'd look. Her eyes darted around the station, searching for an escape she knew wasn't there. Then she saw her, a young woman sitting alone on a bench, crying into a handkerchief. Beside her was a small trunk with the initials E.M. painted in neat white letters. Ruby approached cautiously. "Excuse me, miss. Are you all right?" The woman looked up. Her face was flushed with fever. "Just feeling poorly," she said, her voice weak. "The doctor says it's just influenza, but I must reach Montana. My fiancé is waiting for me." She coughed, a deep rattling sound that shook her whole body. "Montana?" Ruby asked, her mind racing. "Which part?" "Clearwater, near Helena." The woman extended a trembling hand. "I'm Elizabeth Morgan, soon to be Mrs. Calloway." The name hit Ruby like a physical blow. Seth Calloway, Wolf Creek Ranch, the man from the advertisement. Elizabeth coughed again, more violently this time. When she pulled her handkerchief away, Ruby saw a bright splash of crimson. Blood. "You need a doctor," Ruby said, her own fear momentarily forgotten. "No time," Elizabeth whispered. "The stage. Stage for Clearwater, Montana Territory," the depot manager yelled. "Departing in 10 minutes." Elizabeth tried to stand, but swayed. Ruby caught her. "You can't travel like this." "I must," Elizabeth insisted. She fumbled in her bag, pulling out a letter. "He sent money, $50, for a bride he's never even met." She gave a weak, watery laugh. Ruby's neck prickled. Blackwell's man was getting closer, moving methodically through the crowd. A desperate, crazy idea sparked in her mind. "Elizabeth, let me help you to a doctor," Ruby urged, helping the weak woman to her feet. "But my luggage, the stage." "I'll make sure they hold it for you," Ruby promised, guiding her toward a side entrance. She flagged down a porter. "This woman needs a doctor, immediately." The porter took one look at Elizabeth's face and nodded. "My cousin works at Denver General. I'll get her there." "Thank you," Ruby said, pressing a coin into his hand. "Please hurry." As the porter led the sick woman away, Ruby ran back to the bench. Blackwell's man was at the ticket counter now, and the agent was pointing in her direction. Time was up. She snatched the letter Elizabeth had dropped. Inside, just as she'd said, $50 and a brief formal note from Seth Calloway. She looked at the ticket, the trunk, and then toward the entrance where danger was closing in. Everyone gets one chance to start fresh. "Final call for Clearwater, Montana." Ruby made her choice. She tucked the letter and money into her dress, grabbed the handle of Elizabeth's trunk, and walked straight for the stagecoach. "Ticket, ma'am?" the driver asked. She handed him Elizabeth's ticket. "Elizabeth Morgan," she said, the name feeling alien on her tongue. "Better hurry aboard, Miss Morgan," the driver said, tipping his hat. "Long journey ahead." As the coach pulled away, Ruby saw him, Blackwell's man, rushing onto the platform, his eyes scanning the faces of the departing passengers. She shrank back into the shadows, her heart pounding. She was leaving Ruby Hayes behind. For how long, she didn't know. For now, she was Elizabeth Morgan, a mail-order bride on her way to Montana. She was running from one dangerous man straight into the arms of a complete stranger. The woman he'd pulled from the snow was still unconscious. He'd carried her into the small line cabin, a place no one at the main ranch ever used. It was secluded, hidden by a thick stand of pines. Safe. He laid her on the simple cot, covering her with thick wool blankets. He cleaned the gash on her temple. It was shallow, but she'd lost blood. Her skin was still unnervingly cold. He built up the fire in the small stone hearth until it roared, trying to chase the deep chill from her bones. He sat in the cabin's only other chair, watching her, a rifle across his lap. The storm howled outside, a wild symphony of wind and ice. Who was she? And who were the men chasing her? He had advertised for a bride, yes, but it was a lie, a trap. The real Elizabeth Morgan was supposed to be a courier, a contact from a man in Denver who was helping him fight a war for his land. She was supposed to be bringing evidence, documents that would expose the powerful men trying to steal Wolf Creek Ranch out from under him. Men who had already killed his father to try and get it. Now this stranger was here instead. Had his plan been discovered? Was she a part of their scheme, sent to infiltrate his life? Or was she like him, just another victim caught in their web? Hours passed. The storm raged. The woman on the cot didn't move. He checked her pulse again. Still there. Still faint. Just before dawn, as the storm began to quiet, she moaned. Her eyelids fluttered. He leaned forward, his hand instinctively going to the rifle. Her eyes opened. They were a deep, startling green, full of confusion and fear. She stared at the rough log ceiling, then at him. Where am I? She whispered, her voice hoarse. You're safe, he said, his voice low and calm. You had an accident. I found you in the snow. She tried to sit up but winced, her hand going to her head. I don't remember. Remember what? He pressed, keeping his voice even. Anything, she whispered, and the terror in her eyes was real. He'd seen men lie, seen them bluff, seen them beg. This was different. This was the raw, empty fear of a person completely adrift. My name. I don't know my name. He stared at her. Amnesia. It was the perfect complication, or the perfect lie. He had a choice to make. He could press her, try to force a truth she might not even have. Or he could play the hand he'd been dealt. He could use this. He made his decision. It's all right, he said, his voice softer now. You hit your head hard. It will come back to you. He stood up and walked over to the cot, looking down at her. Your name is Elizabeth Morgan, and you've come here to be my wife. The lie hung in the small cabin, thick and heavy, her eyes wide and searching, locked onto his. She didn't question him. She was a drowning woman, and he had just thrown her a rope that might save her or hang her. My wife, she repeated, the words a fragile breath. That's right, Seth said, his face an unreadable mask. Welcome to Wolf Creek, Elizabeth. For the next 2 days, the storm kept them locked in the tiny cabin. He told her stories, weaving a life for her out of thin air. He said they had corresponded for months, that she was a nurse from Denver, an orphan seeking a new start. He was careful, giving her details he'd gotten from the real Elizabeth's letters, facts a person with amnesia might slowly recall. She absorbed it all, her brow furrowed in concentration, desperate to grasp the threads of a past that wasn't hers. She called herself Elizabeth, the name sounding clumsy and foreign on her tongue. He watched her every move. He saw the way she handled herself, a quickness in her eyes, a wariness in her posture that didn't fit the picture of a city nurse. When he handed her a cup of coffee, her fingers brushed against his, and he felt the faint, rough calluses of a life of labor, not medicine. She was a mystery, and every piece of it put him more on edge. When the storm finally broke, he knew he couldn't keep her in the cabin forever. His brother James would be wondering where he was. The deception had to expand. The main house is just a mile from here, he told her. My brother James is there, and our housekeeper Hannah. They're expecting you. The ride to the ranch house was tense. Elizabeth looked at the vast, snow-covered landscape with a kind of wonder and terror. He saw her studying landmarks, as if trying to memorize an escape route. Smart. As they crested the final hill, Wolf Creek Ranch came into view. The large log house, the sturdy outbuildings, the corrals filled with the finest horses in the territory. It was his home, his legacy, everything he was fighting for. And he had just brought a potential enemy right through the front door. An elderly woman stood on the porch, straight-backed and sharp-eyed. Hannah. Beside her was his younger brother, James, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud of suspicion. "Seth!" James called out, his voice sharp. "We were about to send out a search party. Where have you been?" His eyes landed on the woman riding beside his brother, and his suspicion hardened into outright hostility. "Got caught in the storm," Seth said, dismounting and helping Elizabeth down. Her legs were shaky. "This is Elizabeth Morgan, my bride." Hannah's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, swept over the small copper-haired woman. She said nothing, but her silence was a judgment in itself. James stared at her, then back at Seth, his disbelief clear. "This is her?" he said, his voice laced with contempt. "She's not what you described." "The journey was difficult," Seth said, his voice a low warning. "She had an accident." "An accident," James repeated, his gaze fixed on the fading bruise on her temple. "Right." He knew. James knew something was wrong, but for now he kept his peace. Hannah led Elizabeth inside, her face a stony mask. Seth stayed behind with his brother. "What is this, Seth?" James demanded, his voice a low hiss. "Who is she?" "I got your telegram. The description of Elizabeth Morgan. Tall, blonde. That ain't her." "I know," Seth said quietly. "You know?" James stared at him, incredulous. "Then who is she? And why are you calling her by another woman's name?" "I found her in the snow during the storm. She was being chased. She hit her head. She doesn't remember who she is." James's jaw dropped. "Amnesia? You can't be serious." "Seth, this is a trick. It has to be. Graham's people—" "I know the risks," Seth cut him off. "But look at her, James. She's terrified. Whoever she is, whatever she's done, she's in trouble. And maybe, just maybe, her trouble and our trouble are connected. Or maybe she's the one they sent to burn us to the ground. It's a chance I have to take," Seth said, his gaze fixed on the house. "For now, she is Elizabeth Morgan. To you, to Hannah, to anyone who asks. We play this out. We see what happens. Am I clear?" James stared at his brother, his eyes full of anger and worry. But he had never disobeyed a direct order from Seth. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Clear. But when this blows up in your face, don't say I didn't warn you." Seth watched him stalk off toward the barn. He knew he was playing with fire. He had a woman with no memory in his house, a suspicious brother, and a housekeeper who saw everything. And somewhere out there, the real Elizabeth Morgan was missing, and the men who were after his ranch were getting closer every day. He had set a trap for his enemies, and now he was beginning to wonder if he was the one who was about to be caught in it. Ruby, though she didn't know her name was Ruby, felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. They gave her a beautiful room upstairs, the Blue Room, with a four-poster bed and a view of the snow-covered valley. It was more luxury than she had ever known, yet it felt like a cage. Seth had brought her a trunk. Her trunk, he'd said, the one with the initials EM on it. Inside, she found neatly folded dresses, sensible shoes, and a heavy cloak lined with fur. But beneath the clothes, there were other things. Books filled with medical terms she couldn't understand, and a leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was elegant, precise. It detailed a life that felt utterly alien. "Assisted Dr. Albright with an amputation today." The patient, a young rail worker, was brave. She read about treatments for fever, remedies for coughs, notes on setting broken bones. This Elizabeth Morgan was a healer, a woman of skill and knowledge, and she was supposed to be her. The thought was a cold knot of terror in her stomach. How could she ever pretend to be this person? The housekeeper, Hannah, watched her with eyes that missed nothing. She asked pointed questions about nursing, about Denver, about a life Ruby couldn't remember. Ruby would stammer, feigning a headache, claiming her memory was still foggy from the fall. But she could feel Hannah's skepticism like a physical weight. James, Seth's brother, was worse. He didn't bother with questions. He just watched her with open contempt, as if he knew she was a fraud and was just waiting for her to slip up. Only Seth treated her with a strange, guarded kindness. He would talk to her in the evenings by the fire, telling her more about their supposed courtship through letters. He spoke of the valley, of his parents, of his fight to keep the ranch. There was a deep sadness in him, a loneliness that resonated with the vast emptiness inside her own mind. She found herself clinging to his presence, the only solid thing in a world of confusion. But sometimes she would catch him looking at her with an intensity that had nothing to do with kindness. It was a look of assessment, of calculation. It was the look of a man trying to solve a puzzle, and she was the puzzle. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, she was in her room, reading the journal, when a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room tilted, and for a split second, an image flashed in her mind. Not of a hospital, but of a crowded room filled with smoke and laughter. The sound of a tinny piano, the flash of a red dress, a man's face, handsome but with eyes as cold as a winter river. The image was gone as quickly as it came, leaving her breathless and shaking. It wasn't a memory of Elizabeth Morgan's. It was something else, something that belonged to her. She didn't tell Seth. She was too afraid. What if her real memories weren't of a respectable nurse? What if she was someone bad, someone who deserved to be chased through a blizzard? A few days later, a visitor arrived. A man with a tin star pinned to his coat. Deputy U.S. Marshal Ben Cooper. He was young, with watchful, intelligent eyes. "Seth, James," he said, shaking their hands as he stomped the snow from his boots. "Just came to give you an update." His eyes fell on Ruby as she came down the stairs. "And this must be Miss Morgan." "Elizabeth, this is Deputy Cooper," Seth said, his voice carefully neutral. "He's an old friend." "Ma'am," Cooper said, tipping his hat, but his eyes weren't friendly. They were sharp, analytical. He looked at her height, her copper hair, and a flicker of something she couldn't read crossed his face. "I was sorry to hear about your stagecoach." Ruby froze. My, my stagecoach?" "Yes," Cooper said, his gaze never leaving her face. "The one from Denver. We found it yesterday at the bottom of a ravine in the high pass. Looked like the driver lost control in the snow." He paused. "There were no survivors." The blood drained from Ruby's face. No survivors, but she was supposed to have been on that coach. That's, that's impossible," she stammered, looking at Seth, her mind reeling. I, I was, Elizabeth got off at the way station before the pass." Seth cut in smoothly, his hand resting on her arm in a gesture that looked supportive, but felt like a warning. "She was feeling unwell. I rode out and met her there." Cooper's eyes shifted to Seth. The air in the room was suddenly thick with unspoken things. "Is that so? Funny. The station manager didn't mention any passengers getting off, and the manifest listed an Elizabeth Morgan as traveling the whole way to Clearwater." "Paperwork gets mixed up," Seth said, his voice hard as iron. "I suppose it does," Cooper said, but his eyes were back on Ruby. "There was one other thing. Another woman on the stage, a saloon girl from Denver named Ruby Hayes. Her body wasn't found at the wreck." He looked directly at Ruby. "She had copper hair," they said. "About your height." Ruby felt the floor drop out from under her. Ruby Hayes. The name echoed in the empty space of her mind, terrifyingly familiar. "We believe she may have survived the crash and wandered off into the storm," Cooper continued. "But the strange thing is, a witness at the Denver depot said he saw her helping another woman, a sick woman, just before the stage left. A woman who matched Elizabeth Morgan's description perfectly." He took a step closer. "So you see my confusion, ma'am. The woman who was supposed to be on the stage wasn't. The woman who wasn't supposed to be on it is missing. And now I arrive at Wolf Creek Ranch and find a woman calling herself Elizabeth Morgan, who looks a whole lot more like the missing saloon girl, Ruby Hayes." The trap had been sprung. Seth's lie had been exposed, and Ruby was standing in the middle of it, a woman with two names and a past that was suddenly coming for her with a vengeance. The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Ruby couldn't breathe. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Ruby Hayes, saloon girl. The words felt both alien and true. The fragmented memory of the smoky room, the piano, the man with the cold eyes. It was beginning to make a terrible kind of sense. Seth didn't flinch. He met the marshal's gaze, his expression unreadable. My bride had a difficult journey, Marshal. She's not well. Her memory is still affected by her fall. You're upsetting her. I'm just stating the facts, Seth, Cooper said, his voice deceptively mild. And the facts don't add up. A stagecoach full of people is found at the bottom of a ravine. Everyone is dead, but it's ruled an accident. A key witness who was supposed to be on that coach is conveniently safe here with you. And a woman who shouldn't have been on it has vanished into thin air. He turned his piercing gaze back to Ruby. You're telling me you don't remember anything about a woman named Ruby Hayes? Ruby shook her head, a small, helpless gesture. She couldn't form the words. She felt trapped between Seth's lie and a truth she didn't even know. I think I'll stay for a few days, Cooper announced, looking back at Seth. Check in on the investigation. Make sure Miss Morgan is feeling herself again. The threat was clear. He wasn't leaving until he got answers. That night, the tension in the ranch house was unbearable. James shot Ruby looks of pure hatred. Hannah served dinner in a stony silence. After the meal, Seth asked Ruby to join him in his study. The room was filled with books and maps. It smelled of leather and wood smoke. It was his sanctuary, and she felt like an intruder. He closed the door behind them. He knows, Ruby whispered, her voice trembling. He suspects, Seth corrected, his voice low. Cooper's smart. He knows something's wrong, but he can't prove it. Why did you lie for me? She asked, looking up at him. You're lying to a federal marshal. You could go to jail. He walked over to the window, staring out at the moonlit snow. Because I think you're in the same trouble I am. I think the people who are after my ranch are the same people who are after you. He turned to face her. The men who were chasing you in the snow, that stagecoach crash, I don't think it was an accident. I think it was an attack. They were trying to kill Elizabeth Morgan before she could get to me. The real Elizabeth Morgan, Ruby whispered. The nurse. Yes, Seth said. She wasn't just a mail-order bride. She was working with Cooper. She was bringing me evidence against a man named Victor Graham. He's the head of a banking consortium in Helena that's been trying to force me to sell this ranch. He paused. My father refused to sell. A few weeks later, he was killed in a hunting accident. Ruby gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. They made it look clean, Seth continued, his voice tight with suppressed rage. But I know they killed him. Graham wants the water rights that come with this land. With them, he can control the entire valley. He can force the new railroad to go through his property. He'll make a fortune. He took a step closer to her. Elizabeth was bringing me the proof. Proof that Graham was using threats, intimidation, and murder to get what he wants. But something went wrong in Denver, and somehow you ended up in her place. His eyes bored into hers. Ruby Hayes. Does that name mean anything to you? I don't know, she stammered. I had a flash, a memory, a saloon, a man with cold eyes. Tell me about him, Seth urged. He was handsome, she said, struggling to recall the fleeting image. Well-dressed. But his eyes, he looked at me like I was a thing, something he owned. She shuddered. There was a book, a ledger. I think I saw something in it. Seth's expression sharpened. A ledger? What did you see? Names, she whispered, and numbers, land deals. I saw the name, Clearwater Valley. Seth's face went pale. You saw Graham's ledger? I don't know, she cried, pressing her hands to her temples. I don't remember. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders. The intensity in his eyes was blazing. Think, was there another name? A partner? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force the memory. The man's face swam in her vision. She could almost hear his voice, cold and smooth. Curious little bird, aren't you? Blackwell, she whispered. Edwin Blackwell. Seth's hands dropped from her shoulders. He looked as if she had physically struck him. Blackwell, he repeated, his voice a hollow echo. He's Graham's silent partner, the money man, the one who stays in the shadows. No one has ever been able to connect them. He stared at her, a look of dawning, horrified understanding on his face. Until now, he finally understood. She wasn't a plant. She wasn't an enemy. She was the one person who could bring them all down. The stagecoach crash wasn't for the real Elizabeth Morgan. It was for her. They had been trying to kill Ruby Hayes, and by taking Elizabeth's place, she had jumped from the frying pan directly into the fire, and she had dragged Seth Calloway and his entire family in with her. The revelation changed everything. The looks James gave her were no longer just hostile, they were fearful. Hannah stopped asking questions and started watching the horizon, her lips a thin, grim line. Even Marshall Cooper's presence felt less like a threat and more like a fragile shield. Ruby's mind was a battlefield. Flashes of her past life kept breaking through. The smell of cheap perfume and stale whiskey, the feel of a man's hand too tight on her arm, and always the cold, possessive eyes of Edwin Blackwell. The name now felt like a brand on her soul. She was Ruby Hayes, a saloon girl from the frontier moon, and she had seen something that could get her killed. She and Seth spent hours in his study, trying to piece together her fragmented memories. He would spread maps of the territory across his desk, and she would try to recall the names from the ledger. Rimrock Basin, Helena Properties. Each name was another piece of a vast, corrupt puzzle. "They're not just trying to steal this valley," Seth said one night, his finger tracing a line on the map. "They're trying to steal the whole territory." A strange intimacy grew between them in those hushed, lamplit hours. He was no longer just her protector. He was her confidant. She saw past his hardened exterior to the man underneath, a man fighting a desperate battle for his home, for his father's memory. And he in turn began to see her not as a liability, but as an ally, a survivor. One evening, as they were working, he looked up from the map, his blue eyes searching her face. "You're very brave, you know that?" The simple words made her throat tighten. No one had ever called her brave. "I'm not," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm a coward. I ran." "You survived," he corrected gently. "There's a difference." The fragile peace was shattered a few days later. James came storming into the house, his face pale with fury. He threw a worn, leather-bound book onto the table in front of Seth. It was the journal, Elizabeth Morgan's journal. "I found this hidden in her room," James said, his voice shaking with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at Ruby. "Under a loose floorboard, along with this." He tossed something else onto the table, a small, folded piece of paper, a wanted poster. Ruby stared at it, her blood turning to ice. It was a crude drawing, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The copper hair, the green eyes. Underneath the words, $500 reward for information leading to the whereabouts of Ruby Hayes. Wanted for theft. Contact Edwin Blackwell, Denver. "Theft?" Seth said, looking from the poster to Ruby. "She's not a witness, Seth. She's a criminal," James yelled. "Blackwell isn't trying to silence her. He's trying to get his property back. She played you. She played us all." "Is this true?" Seth asked, his voice dangerously quiet. His eyes, which had started to look at her with warmth, were now as cold and hard as a Montana winter. I I don't know," Ruby whispered, her world crumbling around her. Could it be true? Had she stolen from Blackwell? Was that what this was all about? Was she not a victim, but a villain? "The journal," James pressed, his voice full of disgust. "Look at it. It's not just medical notes. Read the last few entries, the ones from Denver." Seth picked up the journal. He flipped to the end, his eyes scanning the elegant script. Ruby watched as the color drained from his face. He looked up at her, and the expression in his eyes was one of utter betrayal. "The real Elizabeth Morgan," he said, his voice a dead monotone. "She wasn't a stranger. She was my wife." The words didn't make sense. Ruby stared at him, her mind unable to process what he'd just said. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice a thin thread. "My wife," Seth repeated, his voice breaking. He tossed the journal onto the table. "My first wife, Caroline, the one who cleaned out our safe and ran off with a cattle buyer." He looked at Ruby, and the pain in his eyes was a raw, open wound. "According to this, she didn't just run off. She went to Denver. She changed her name. She became a nurse." He pointed a shaking finger at the book. "She became Elizabeth Morgan." Ruby's head spun. It was impossible. "She wrote in her journal that she was sick," Seth continued, his voice thick with a grief he had buried for years. She knew she was dying. She said she had wronged me, that she wanted to make things right. She contacted Cooper. She was coming home, not as a witness, as my wife. She was coming home to die. The full weight of the deception, not just hers but Caroline's, crashed down on Ruby. She had not only stolen a stranger's identity, she had stolen a dying woman's last chance at redemption. She had stolen a husband's last chance to forgive his wife. "And you," James spat, his face contorted with disgust. "A thief from a saloon. You took her place." Suddenly, Marshal Cooper burst through the door, his face grim. He didn't seem to notice the high-voltage tension in the room. "Seth," he said, his voice urgent, "I just got word from Helena. That woman in the hospital, the one who survived the crash, she died this morning." A heavy silence fell over the room. Caroline was dead. "But before she died," Cooper continued, his eyes landing on Ruby, "she said something. She kept repeating a name. The name of the saloon girl who helped her at the depot. The one who promised to make sure her luggage got to Montana." He took a deep breath. "She said you were bringing a message for Seth, that you had to tell him she was sorry, that everything he needed to know was hidden in the lining of her trunk." Everyone's eyes flew to the trunk sitting in the corner of the room, the trunk with the initials EM on it. Cooper looked at the wanted poster, then at Ruby, then at the trunk. "It seems," he said slowly, "that everyone in this room has been lying about something." He drew his gun. "And I think it's time we found out what's really in that trunk." Seth moved first. He strode to the trunk, the one he had carried into the house for a woman he thought was a stranger. He threw open the lid. The dresses, the books, they were all there. He felt along the inside, along the fabric lining. His fingers found a loose seam. He tore it open. Inside, tucked away, was not a stack of documents. It wasn't evidence against Victor Graham. It was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon and a small leather-bound ledger. Ruby recognized it instantly. It was Blackwell's. Seth opened the ledger, and there, in neat, precise columns, was the entire conspiracy. The land deals, the illegal transfers, the bribes. But there was something else. A list of names under the heading Disbursements, payments, to judges, to politicians, and to the sheriff of Clearwater County. They weren't just fighting a land baron, they were fighting the law itself. And at the bottom of the last page, there was a single, shocking entry. Final payment to N. Calloway for transfer of Wolf Creek water rights upon his death. James gasped. "What does that mean?" Seth's face was a mask of stone. He looked at the date of the entry. It was 2 days before his father's hunting accident. "It means," Seth said, his voice a low, terrifying growl, "that my father didn't refuse to sell. He sold us out." The betrayal was absolute. Nathan Calloway, the man who had built Wolf Creek from nothing, the man whose memory Seth was fighting to honor, had betrayed them. He had sold their birthright, their future, to the very men who then had him killed to seal the deal. "But the deed was never transferred," Cooper said, staring at the ledger. "Nathan died before he could sign it over, which means the deal was never finalized. The ranch is still legally yours." "That's why they've been pushing so hard," Seth said, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "They didn't just want to buy the ranch. They were trying to collect on a deal they'd already paid for, a deal my father made in secret." Suddenly, a new voice echoed from the doorway, a smooth, cultured voice that made the blood freeze in Ruby's veins. "A deal I intend to see honored." Edwin Blackwell stood there, flanked by 2 armed men. He looked thinner than Ruby remembered, his face pale, but his eyes burned with a feverish intensity. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "And you, my dear Ruby," he said, his lips curling into a cruel smile as his gaze fell upon her. "You have something that belongs to me." He wasn't looking at the ledger. He was looking at her. "I believe your wanted poster mentioned theft. A small matter of $10,000 you took from my safe the night you ran." James and Seth stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. $10,000. A fortune. "It's a lie," Ruby insisted, though a new sickening memory was surfacing. the weight of a heavy bag in her hands. The frantic escape through the back alleys of Denver. Is it? Blackwell said softly. We can search your things, of course, unless you'd prefer to just come with me now. We have so much to discuss. The ranch was surrounded, the law was corrupt, and the man she had been running from was standing in her doorway, holding all the cards. She was trapped, no memory, no allies, and now a crime she couldn't even remember committing hanging over her head. The tension in the room was a coiled snake, ready to strike. Blackwell's men had their hands on their guns. Cooper had his revolver trained on Blackwell. Seth and James stood frozen, caught between the lies of their father and the accusations against the woman who had turned their lives upside down. You're not taking her anywhere, Seth said, his voice a low growl. He took a step forward, placing himself between Ruby and Blackwell. Blackwell laughed, a dry, rasping sound. Always the hero, Calloway, just like your father. So noble, so principled, right up until the moment he signed away your future for a stack of cash. Shut your mouth, James snarled, moving to stand beside his brother. The truth hurts, doesn't it? Blackwell taunted. He was weak, drowning in debt. I offered him a way out, and he took it. He just wasn't smart enough to live to enjoy it. He gestured with his gun toward the ledger in Seth's hand. Now that book and the girl, I'll be on my way, and you can live out your miserable lives on this worthless patch of dirt. The ranch isn't worthless, Seth said, his eyes blazing. Not without the water rights your deal was contingent on, a deal that is now null and void. A legal technicality, Blackwell scoffed. One that my partner, Mr. Graham, is on his way here right now to renegotiate, with the help of your very cooperative sheriff. The trap was closing. Graham and the crooked sheriff were coming. They were outmanned, outgunned, with no one to call for help. There's still the matter of the $10,000, Blackwell said, his eyes locking onto Ruby again. A debt I fully intend to collect, one way or another. I don't have your money, Ruby cried, the desperation in her voice raw. Oh, I think you do, Blackwell said. He nodded to one of his men. Check her room. Before anyone could react, the man was up the stairs. A moment later, he came back down, holding a heavy cloth bag, the bag Ruby remembered from her fragmented dream. He opened it and poured the contents onto the floor. Stacks of bundled cash spilled out. Ruby stared at the money, horrified. It was true, she was a thief. You see? Blackwell said with a triumphant smirk. She's not the innocent victim you thought she was, Calloway. She's a common criminal, and she's mine. But Seth wasn't looking at the money. He was looking at the bag it had come out of. It was a simple canvas sack, but on the side, stenciled in faded black ink, were the words, Montana Territorial Bank, Helena, Victor Graham's Bank. That's not your money, Blackwell, Seth said slowly, a dawning realization in his eyes. That's my father's. Blackwell's smirk faltered. It's the money you paid him, Seth continued, his voice low and dangerous. The money he took for selling us out. He never spent it. He hid it. He looked at Ruby. And somehow, you found it. The memory hit Ruby with the force of a physical blow. Not the saloon, a different room, a dusty office, her hands searching through a dead man's desk. It wasn't Blackwell's safe she'd robbed. It was the office of the saloon owner, Harold. He'd been holding the money for someone who had died, and she had taken it, thinking it would be her ticket to a new life. It was my father's money, James whispered, staring at the cash on the floor. Which makes her a thief either way, Blackwell snapped, recovering his composure. Now I'm done playing games. The girl. The ledger. Now. Suddenly, from outside, a single gunshot cracked through the air. One of Blackwell's men, who had been standing guard on the porch, crumpled to the ground. Everyone froze. In the doorway, silhouetted against the bright snow, stood a figure. A woman, bundled in furs, a smoking rifle in her hand. Her face was weathered, her eyes as sharp and cold as the winter air. You looking for a saloon girl? Clara Winter said, her voice a gravelly rasp. You found one. Clara's arrival was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Blackwell's remaining man spun toward the door, raising his pistol. But James was faster. He launched himself forward, tackling the gunman in a spray of splintered wood and flying snow. Cooper opened fire, his shot aimed not at Blackwell, but at the lamp hanging from the ceiling. It exploded, plunging the room into a chaotic mix of daylight and deep shadow. Seth didn't hesitate. He shoved Ruby behind him. "Get to the cellar!" he yelled, firing his own rifle over their heads, providing cover. "There's a tunnel behind the wine barrels. Go!" Ruby was frozen for a second, the scene before her a surreal nightmare of shouting men and exploding gunfire. Then Clara grabbed her arm, her grip like iron. "He said go, child! Move!" They scrambled toward the kitchen, the sounds of the fight raging behind them. They could hear James grunting as he wrestled with the gunman, Cooper shouting commands, the roar of Seth's rifle. They half fell down the cellar stairs into the cool, damp darkness. Hannah was already there, a lantern lit, her face grim but composed. "This way," she said, her voice steady, as she began to move heavy barrels away from the stone wall, revealing a narrow, dark opening. The tunnel. Ruby hesitated at the entrance, looking back up the stairs. "We can't just leave them." "We're no good to them dead," Clara snapped, pushing her forward. "Now get in there!" The tunnel was claustrophobic and cold, smelling of earth and damp rock. Hannah led the way with the lantern, her small frame moving with surprising speed. Clara and Ruby followed close behind. The sounds of the gunfight faded, replaced by the sound of their own frantic breathing and the drip of water from the tunnel ceiling. They ran for what felt like an eternity. The passage twisted and turned, sloping downward. "The creek runs over us here," Hannah said, her voice echoing in the tight space. "We're almost halfway." Suddenly, from behind them, a new sound. The scrape of boots on rock. A muffled curse. They weren't alone in the tunnel. Hannah extinguished the lantern instantly, plunging them into absolute, terrifying darkness. "Someone's following us," she whispered. Ruby's heart hammered against her ribs. She reached out, her hand finding Clara's. They stood frozen, listening. The footsteps were getting closer, moving recklessly, without any attempt at stealth. "They know we're in here," Hannah breathed. "We have to hide." She grabbed Ruby's hand, her touch surprisingly cold, and pulled her toward the side of the tunnel. "There's an old mining shaft here. It's a dead end, but it might conceal us." She guided them into a narrow side passage, barely wide enough for them to stand single file. They pressed themselves against the cold, damp stone, holding their breath as the light from a lantern appeared in the main tunnel, growing brighter, closer. Ruby could hear the men talking now. "The boss wants the girl alive," one of them said. "Graham just wants the ledger." "Let's just find them," the other grumbled. "This place gives me the creeps." The light washed past their hiding place. The men didn't even slow down. They were heading for the exit, assuming they could trap them there. As their footsteps receded, Ruby let out a shaky breath. But Hannah didn't move. She stood at the entrance of the side passage, listening. "Stay here," Hannah whispered. "They sent 2 men. That means Blackwell is likely alone back at the house, with Seth and the others. I'm going back." "You can't!" Ruby protested. "It's too dangerous." "Seth and James are my boys," Hannah said, her voice fierce. "I promised their mother I'd look after them. I'm not leaving them to fight alone." Before Ruby or Clara could argue, she slipped out of the hiding place and disappeared back into the darkness, moving with a silence that was unnerving. "That woman is either the bravest person I've ever met or the craziest," Clara muttered in the dark. They waited in the suffocating blackness, the silence broken only by the steady drip of water. Minutes stretched into an hour, then another. Suddenly, a new sound echoed from the direction of the ranch house. Not footsteps, a scream. A man's scream, high-pitched and full of agony, cut short abruptly. Ruby and Clara stared into the darkness, their hearts pounding. Then silence again. A deep, profound silence that was somehow more terrifying than the scream. "What do we do?" Ruby whispered, her voice trembling. "We wait for a signal," Clara said, though she sounded anything but certain. More time passed. Ruby had lost all sense of it. She was trapped in a timeless, lightless world, her imagination running wild with the terrible things that might be happening back at the house. Then a flicker of light appeared in the distance, a single lantern coming towards them. Clara raised the small derringer she had pulled from her coat. Stay behind me, she hissed. The light grew closer, steadier. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was Seth. His face was bruised and streaked with soot, but he was alive. He was alone. Seth! Ruby cried, rushing forward. He caught her, holding her tight for a second before setting her away from him. His face was grim. Where's Hannah? She went back, Ruby said. We heard a scream. That was Blackwell, Seth said, his voice flat and empty. Hannah. She found him. She used a knife. He shook his head as if trying to clear a horrible image. She saved my life. But one of his men, he got off a shot before James could stop him. Is she? Clara began. Seth's face was a mask of grief. She's gone. The loss was a physical blow. Hannah, the stern, watchful woman who had been the heart of the ranch, was gone. James and Cooper are securing the house, Seth said, his voice regaining its strength. But Graham and the sheriff are on their way. We don't have much time. He looked at Ruby. The ledger is everything. Caroline, Elizabeth, she died trying to get it to me. Hannah died protecting it. We have to get it to Helena, to the territorial governor. It's the only way to expose the entire conspiracy. He held out a heavy oilskin pouch. James and I will hold them off here. We'll give you as much time as we can. Cooper knows a back trail through the mountains. He's waiting for you at the tunnel exit. You and Clara have to ride for Helena. Don't stop for anything. No, Ruby said, shaking her head. I won't leave you. You must, Seth said, his hands gripping her arms. His blue eyes burned with a desperate intensity. This isn't about the ranch anymore. It's about justice. For my father, for Hannah, for Caroline. Blackwell is dead, but Graham is the head of the snake. You're the only one who can stop him now. He pressed the pouch into her hands. You're the only one who can testify to what's in that ledger. You are the witness. He looked at her, and in that moment, all the barriers between them fell away. He wasn't just a rancher fighting for his land. He was a man who had lost almost everything. I will come for you, he said, his voice a low promise. I swear it. Now go. He gave her a last hard look, then turned and disappeared back into the darkness without another word, leaving her with the weight of his trust, the fate of the valley, and the lives of everyone she had come to care about in her hands. The tunnel exit was a dark slash in a snow-covered hillside, hidden by a thicket of barren aspens. Marshal Cooper was there, just as Seth had promised, with 3 horses saddled and ready. He had a long gash on his forearm, hastily bandaged, but his eyes were clear and focused. He took in their soot-stained faces and the grief etched on Ruby's. Hannah? He asked quietly. Ruby just shook her head, unable to speak. A muscle twitched in Cooper's jaw. He handed the reins to Clara and Ruby. The main road to Clearwater will be watched, he said, his voice all business. We take the high trail. It's longer, more dangerous, but they won't expect it. We ride hard and we don't stop. Ruby pulled herself into the saddle, the oilskin pouch with the ledger clutched in her hand. She looked back in the direction of the ranch, a place she had known for only a few weeks, but which now felt more like home than any place she had ever been. She thought of Seth and James, preparing for a final stand against a corrupt sheriff and a powerful man who would stop at nothing. Will they be all right? She asked, the words torn from her. Seth Calloway is the toughest man I know, Cooper said, swinging onto his own horse. If anyone can hold them off, he can. But we can't help them by waiting here. Our job is to make sure their fight isn't for nothing. Let's ride. They rode into the mountains, the world a vast, silent expanse of white and blue. The trail was treacherous, a narrow path clinging to the side of the mountain, with a sheer drop on one side. The air grew thin and cold, burning their lungs. They said nothing, saving their breath for the climb. The only sounds were the crunch of the horses' hoofs in the snow and the mournful cry of the wind. Ruby rode mechanically, her mind a numb haze of grief and fear. Hannah's face floated before her eyes. Seth's last intense gaze burned in her memory. I will come for you. The promise was a tiny flame in the vast coldness of her despair. They rode for hours. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent. They were exhausted, frozen, but Cooper pushed them on relentlessly. As dusk began to settle, painting the snow in shades of purple and pink. They saw it. Far below them on the main road, a group of riders, at least a dozen men, moving fast in the direction of Wolf Creek. Graham's men, Cooper said, his voice grim. With the sheriff. They're moving in for the kill. We have to go back, Ruby cried, pulling on her reins. And do what? Cooper countered, his voice sharp as broken glass. We have one rifle between us. There are 12 of them. Going back now would be suicide, and it would accomplish nothing. Seth is counting on us to get this ledger to Helena. That is our only mission. His logic was brutal, but undeniable. Ruby felt a wave of helpless rage wash over her. She was running again, always running, leaving the people she cared about to fight her battles. It's not running, child, Clara said, her voice soft beside her. It's surviving. It's what he wants. Ruby swallowed the bitter taste of her own fear and nodded, turning her horse to follow Cooper deeper into the mountains. They rode through the night, the moon a cold silver disk in a sea of stars. They finally stopped in a sheltered canyon just before dawn, allowing the horses to rest and drink from a half-frozen stream. Cooper shared out some dried beef and hardtack from his saddlebags. It tasted like sawdust, but Ruby forced herself to eat. How much further to Helena? She asked. Another day's ride if we push it, Cooper said. But they'll be hunting us now. Graham will know the ledger is missing. He'll send men after us. As if his words were a curse, they heard a sound in the distance. A dog barking. Then another. Hounds, Cooper said, his body instantly tense. He was already kicking dirt over their small fire. They're using trackers. We have to move. Now. They were back on the horses in seconds, pushing them faster now, their desperation giving them a new surge of energy. The barking grew closer. They were being hunted like animals. The trail began to descend, leading them into a thick, dark forest. The trees grew so close together that the branches overhead blocked out the sky. They were riding in a green-tinged twilight. The hounds were closing in, their baying echoing through the trees. Suddenly, Cooper's horse screamed and stumbled, its leg caught in a hidden trap, a poacher's snare. The horse went down hard, throwing Cooper from the saddle. He landed with a sickening crack. Ruby and Clara reined in their horses, turning back. Cooper was lying on the ground, his face pale, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. It's broken, he gasped, the pain making his voice thin. The hounds were almost on them. Go, Cooper said, pulling his revolver from its holster. Take my horse. I'll hold them off as long as I can. We're not leaving you, Ruby insisted, dismounting and rushing to his side. There's no time to argue, he yelled, his face slick with sweat. The ledger is all that matters. Get it to Helena. Give it to Governor Meager himself. No one else. Now go! He cocked his pistol, his eyes fixed on the path behind them. The baying of the hounds was deafening now. Clara grabbed Ruby's arm. He's right, child, we have to go. She pulled Ruby towards Cooper's horse, which had struggled back to its feet, miraculously uninjured. Tears streamed down Ruby's face as she let Clara push her into the saddle. She looked down at the marshal lying broken on the forest floor, preparing to sacrifice himself for them, for the mission. Thank you, she whispered, the words inadequate. He just nodded, his gaze never wavering from the direction of their pursuers. Godspeed, Ruby Hayes, he said. Clara slapped the horse's rump and it bolted forward. Ruby held on, looking back one last time to see Cooper raise his pistol as the first of the hounds burst through the trees. They rode with the sound of gunshots and the savage snarling of dogs echoing behind them until the forest swallowed the sounds and they were alone again. They burst out of the forest and onto a wide, flat plain. In the distance, they could see the faint lights of a town. Helena? Ruby asked, hope surging in her heart. Too small, Clara said, her face grim. That's a mining camp, but it's our only chance. They were pushing their horses to the breaking point. The animals were lathered in sweat, their breathing coming in great heaving gasps. Just as they reached the outskirts of the camp, Ruby's horse stumbled and fell, its legs finally giving out. She was thrown clear, landing hard in the muddy, rutted street. Clara reined in, her own horse barely able to stand. Men were coming out of the saloons and tents, drawn by the commotion. Rough-looking men, miners and prospectors, their faces suspicious in the lantern light. Ruby struggled to her feet, clutching the precious ledger. Her body ached, her spirit was broken, but she had to keep going. Then she saw them. At the far end of the street, a group of riders had appeared. Graham's men. They had circled around, cutting them off. They were trapped. A large man with a grizzled beard and a shotgun stepped forward from the crowd of miners. "What's all this, then?" he demanded. Before Ruby could answer, the leader of Graham's men, a hard-faced man with a scar down his cheek, rode forward. "That woman is a fugitive," he called out, pointing at Ruby. "There's a reward for her capture. Hand her over, and there'll be a share in it for all of you." The miners started murmuring, their eyes shifting from Ruby to the armed men, calculating the odds, the profit. Ruby saw the greed in their faces. She and Clara were alone, surrounded by strangers who would sell them for a few dollars. This was the end. After everything she had been through, after all the sacrifices, it was going to end here, in a muddy street in a nameless mining camp. But then Clara stepped forward, her small frame radiating a surprising authority. "This woman," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and strong, "is under the protection of Seth Calloway of Wolf Creek Ranch, and she is on a mission for the territorial governor himself." The name Calloway caused a stir among the miners. The name was known, respected. The mention of the governor brought a new kind of silence. The man with the scar laughed. "The old woman is lying. Seize them!" His men started to move forward. The miners hesitated, caught in the middle. Ruby knew she had one last card to play. It was a desperate gamble, but it was all she had left. She held up the ledger. "This book," she shouted, her voice shaking but loud, "contains proof. Proof that Victor Graham and the Montana Territorial Bank are trying to steal the land out from under every last one of you. It's all in here. The bribes, the crooked deals, the names of every man he's paid off." A new dangerous murmur went through the crowd. These were men who had gambled everything on their small claims, men who hated the banks and the powerful interests from the East. "She's lying," the scarred man yelled, but his voice was drowned out by the angry shouts of the miners. He drew his pistol. "Last chance. Give me the girl in the book." "I don't think so," said the grizzled miner with the shotgun. He cocked both hammers, the sound echoing ominously in the sudden silence. "It seems to me this lady has a story to tell, and we're going to let her tell it." Other miners raised their own weapons, pistols, rifles, even pickaxes. Graham's men found themselves suddenly facing a small, angry army. The scarred man hesitated, his eyes darting from the hostile crowd to Ruby. He cursed, then slowly lowered his gun. He wheeled his horse around, and he and his men rode out of the camp, swallowed by the darkness. Ruby sagged with relief, her legs giving out. Clara and the grizzled miner rushed to her side. "You all right, miss?" the miner asked, his voice full of rough concern. "I am now," Ruby whispered. "Thanks to you." "We look after our own out here," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "And anyone who stands up to those bloodsuckers in Helena is one of us." He looked at the ledger in her hand. "Now what's this about the governor?" 1 year later, Ruby Calloway stood on the porch of the new Wolf Creek Ranch house. It had been rebuilt from the ashes, stronger and more beautiful than before, with wide windows that let in the Montana sun. The valley was at peace. Victor Graham's empire had crumbled. The ledger, authenticated by bank officials in Helena who had been secretly working against Graham, was irrefutable. Faced with Ruby's testimony and the evidence in his own partner's handwriting, Graham had confessed to everything: the conspiracy, the bribery, the murder of Nathan Calloway. The crooked sheriff was in a federal prison. The territorial government had seized Graham's assets, ensuring that the land would be sold back to the homesteaders he had swindled. Marshal Ben Cooper had survived. The grizzled miner and his friends had found him, half dead but still stubborn, and had carried him to Helena. His leg had healed, and he now walked with a slight limp and a legendary reputation. Clara Winter had decided the mining camp was more her style. She'd used her share of the reward money, a reward posted by a grateful governor, not Edwin Blackwell, to open the most respectable and most profitable hotel and saloon in the territory. Ruby had returned to Wolf Creek not as a fugitive or a housekeeper, but as a hero, and as Seth's intended bride. He had met her on the road from Helena, just as he had promised. He hadn't said much. He just dismounted, pulled her from her horse, and held her as if he would never let her go. They were married a month later by a traveling preacher, with James as the best man and Clara as the maid of honor. She saw him now, riding in from the south pasture, his tall frame silhouetted against the setting sun. Her husband. The sight of him still made her heart ache with a love so deep and fierce it sometimes frightened her. They had been forged in fire and betrayal, and their bond was as strong and unyielding as the mountains that surrounded them. He swung down from his horse, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. He took the porch steps in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. "Everything all right?" she asked, leaning into his familiar strength. "Perfect," he murmured into her hair. He held up a letter. "This came with the mail rider. It's from Denver." Ruby's breath caught. It had been a year, but the past still had a way of sending out ghosts. She took the letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar. She opened it. It was from a lawyer. It stated that per the final will and testament of Mr. Harold Simmons, the late owner of the Frontier Moon Saloon, the $10,000 held in his trust, the money Nathan Calloway had taken as a bribe, was now legally the property of one Ruby Hayes. Attached was a short, scribbled note from Harold himself, written just before he had succumbed to a fever that swept through Denver. "You were always smarter than the rest, Ruby. I knew you'd find a way out. This money was blood money from the start. You use it to build something clean. You earned it." Tears welled in her eyes as she read the note. $10,000. Her own fortune. A clean start, paid for by a past she had finally escaped. "What is it?" Seth asked, his voice full of concern. She handed him the letter. He read it, then looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "It seems," he said, "that you're a woman of property." "It seems," she said, a tear tracing a path down her cheek, "that I am." He wiped the tear away with his thumb. "What will you do with it?" Ruby looked out at the vast, beautiful valley that was her home. She looked at the strong, decent man who was her husband. She thought of Hannah's sacrifice, of Caroline's tragic journey, of Cooper's bravery. She had found more than a new life here. She had found a purpose. "I think," she said slowly, "that this valley could use a proper doctor, and maybe a small hospital, for people like Margaret Wilkins, for women like Caroline." Seth's smile deepened, reaching his eyes. He pulled her closer, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was full of promises for the future. "I think," he said against her mouth, "that's the best idea I've ever heard." She had arrived in a blizzard, a woman with no name and no past, running from a darkness she couldn't comprehend. Now she stood in the warm sunlight, a wife, a landowner, a founder of a community's future. She had found her name, she had found her home, and she had finally stopped running. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the wild and shadowed corners of history.